Welcome to test, ladies and gentlemen. All right, appreciate everybody stopping by real quick. I'm a little bit late today. It's been a long one, so I'm just now. It's like almost 6 o'clock in the morning over there. So forgive me for everybody that's already been up. Probably were looking to be like, hey man, what's going on today with the tournaments? So they did play round 6, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, 6. They did play round 6 today. So I had the game Wesley versus Anish Giri. And of course, follow my people in the Philippines. Maga nang umaga. Kamusta na mabuhay ingat lagi. Masaya kong kiri keng muli. Maraming salamat po sa nanonood. Inga king my video. Appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. Mabuting pagbati. Appreciate it very much. For anybody who is coming from the Netherlands, I'll say hello. And thank you. Appreciate you guys stopping by and taking a look at my stuff. But yes, if you guys are ready to go, I got one here for you. Let's roll. Okay, so we got D4, knight comes to F6. We got C4, E6, knight to C3, bishop to B4. So we do have the Nimzo Indian, a pretty famous, popular opening for some of you out there who know openings. But, you know, like I said before, you know, we're going to get into it in a minute. But, you know, White's not worried about the capture on C3, and you'll see why coming up. E3 is played. We got castles by Black. Bishop comes to D3. We see D5, A3. Bishop takes C3, pawn takes C3. And we do actually see pawn takes C4, then we see bishop takes C4. And as you guys can see, you know, you just kind of have this file open right here, but you have a connected pawn chain here and you have an isolated pawn. So, you know, it's not too bad of a situation. I mean, you can always have, like, if pawn doesn't capture here, you can have the pawn capturing here. It's going to pretty much be roughly the same thing. So you're not looking too bad. We see C5. You know, White has actually a really good center. So, you know, Black has to chip away at that somehow. So we do see C5. Knight comes to F3. We see Queen to C7. You know, just attacking this bishop through this pawn. So, you know, you have to do something about that. So we see bishop back to E2. We see B6. Bishop comes to B2. Which might look kind of strange at first because it's like, man, it's like you got a bunch of pawns in front of it. You do, but, you know, you're going to be clearing those out of the way here pretty soon. And just like I said, we see pawn takes D4. And this is the novelty of the game. So we got pawn takes D4. You know, and then you have the possibility at some point of pushing this pawn up and maybe pushing D5 and stuff. And then you have your bishops all super open, slicing and dicing everywhere. So we got the bishop to A6. We have castles by White. We got bishop takes E2, queen takes E2. Knight B to D7, and then like I said, we do see E4. So as you can see, you do not have the light square bishop anymore. So, you know, once you push D5, this bishop is going to be, you know, really, really good on this diagonal. So we see rook A to C8. We got rook F to C1, queen to B7. And now something has to give because E4 is under defended. So we see rook back to E1. So interesting maneuver, rook to C1, rook back to E1. We got H6. Rook A, B1. And so, you know, everybody's pretty much just playing like secure moves. You know, H6 is just preventing any type of knight G5 situations coming in. We're just making sure our bishop is covered. You never want to just leave your bishop hanging. So we got rook to C7. We see knight down to D2. We're just planning on maneuvering the knight somewhere, you know, pushing F3, getting a nice little pawn chain rolling. And then also we do have a dark squared bishop. So putting our pawns on light squares is preferred. So that way, you know, your bishop has complete movability. We got rook F to C8, knight down to F1. We see queen to C6, and then we see F3 coming in. We got queen down to C2. Now you have a decision you can make. Do you want to trade on C2 or do you want to move the queen somewhere else? It is actually best to move the queen. And I will show you exactly why in a second. So we do see queen to B5 in the game. If we back up, the problem is if you do capture on C2, you give Black like a really, really nice rook, you know, here on C2. And so, I mean, if you try to knock it with this or something, you're going to be having rook coming here. And, you know, I've always told you guys before about how dangerous rooks are in the 7th rank. So really all you need to do is bring this other rook down and you have some real problems on your hand as White. So we do not want to allow that. So you always have to remember, you know, when you do go into a trade, what are you giving your opponent? What are you giving yourself? What are you allowing and possibly preventing? But like I said, White trading queens here on C2 would just be allowing Black, you know, just too much. So we do see we do see queen to b5. We got queen back to c6. Now, trading here is a little bit of a different story because if you did trade, you see rook capturing on c6. You can see that you haven't allowed the rook to penetrate into the second rank, to the 7th rank, basically. And then you can always play like rook up here or even like rook over, just trade the rooks down, stuff like that. So it's definitely not the same trade. But we do see queen coming back to e2. Queen's really wanting to trade on c2. So we see knight to e3, and we allow black to trade, and then we take with the rook. But as you guys can see, there is no penetration going on for white or for black, because, you know, the knight does cover this square, the bishop is covering these two squares. So it's really going to be kind of hard for you to get a rook in there. So, you know, white definitely wanted black to trade on their terms. So we got knight back to e8. We see d5 now. Knight comes to c5. We see pawn takes e6, knight takes e6. We got rook to d2. We see b5, king to f2. We got rook to b7. We see h4. And h4 is just pretty simple. I mean, at some point, you're going to want to try to push this pawn up here and just fix all of your pawns on light squares. And then also this pawn can freeze these two pawns. So it's very practical in-game concepts that we're looking at. So h5 comes to prevent that. We see knight to d5. Really nice square for the knight to go to. We got f6, rook b to d1. We see a5, bishop coming to c3. You know, throwing a little tickle on this pawn over here, seeing if it's ticklish. We got rook to a8. We got rook to b2. We got king to f7, bishop down to e1. We got rook to a6, knight down to e3. We got knight to d6. Bishop takes a5, which kind of seems like, man, it's about to win a pawn, but we do have this weakness on a3 with our pawn. So the rook takes on a5. We see rook takes d6, and then we see rook takes a3. And as you guys can see, we pretty much just traded. You know, neither side is doing better, but we do have to really get rid of this pawn here on the b file for black, because it is a monster pass pawn. So we have to do something about that. So rook comes to d5. We see knight to f4. Rook d takes b5. We see rook takes b5. Rook takes b5. And then we see g6 as black. And we have actually come to a point in the game that if you do want to pause the video and see a really strong move that white has at their disposal, go ahead and do so. Okay, cool. So for those of you that did notice, white is up a pawn. And something I'm always telling you guys, when you are up material, it's usually beneficial for you to trade. So the move in this position, if you found it, congratulations, is not that. It is knight to d5. Knight to d5 is asking a real question to this knight here on f4 because we're really trying to trade it off. And actually in the position, the best possible move is knight takes d5. You know, you can always like do something different. Rook would most likely almost always come to a2, you know, throw a check on the king. You would be having the king move to g3. And then we have a couple of different options. You know, like I said, the best by far is going to be knight takes d5. And then you can take here. And you're going to be having a pass pawn of your own. Or just reducing the amount of material that's on the board, which should be somewhat beneficial. So knight could come to e2. We would see king down to h2. Knight would come to d4, putting a little like attack on the rook. The rook would come up to b7. We would see king to f8, and then we would see king to h3. We are trying to sidestep the taking of this pawn because that pawn on this square was pinned. But you guys can see that we're going to be collecting this pawn at some point. And this is a very critical pawn because this is going to allow this pawn to be passed. So we're going to have a nice little pawn, you know, trying to score a touchdown, which is always the goal. So after king comes to g3, you also have knight takes g2 as a possibility. The rook would take on, or the rook would go to b7 with check. The king would come up to f8. And then we'd see knight taking f6. So as you can see, it's something kind of similar. Knight to e2 with check gave up a lot more resistance. But those are pretty much going to be like the two ways that you want to kind of go forward. But like I said, after we saw g6, we did see rook to b7 immediately with check. We got king to e6. We got rook to b6 with check. King to f7. So we're starting to get to like points in the game where we're starting to kind of shuffle around a little bit. So I'll kind of run through the moves. The rook comes to a2 with check. We see the rook blocking on c2. Rook takes c2. Knight takes c2. And then we see g5. We got pawn takes g5. Now backing up, g3 was possible in this position. It was actually fairly strong because now the knight does have to back up. You can always try to play knight to d3 with check here, but the king is going to be able to come up and you're just really improving white's position. And of course, if the knight tries to come over here and check, it's going to be trapped after this because it doesn't have anywhere to go. So the knight is going to pretty much going to have to come back to one of these two squares. So that's just, you know, serving to kind of push your opponent back a little bit. And that's definitely where you want to be in this type of an endgame. So, but like I said, we did see pawn takes g5. Pawn takes g5, we see knight to d4. We have h4, you know, preventing the pushing of g3 with some serious consequences. Because then you can always follow up with f4 and create, you know, some nice passed pawns. We see g3, pawn takes g3, king takes g3. We see knight to d3. Knight comes to c6. We see king to g6. Knight to e7 with check. King comes to f6. Knight to d5 with check. King to g6. Knight comes to e3. We see king to f6. We got knight to g4. King comes to e6. We have king to g2. We got knight to f4 with check. We see king to f2. Knight comes to d3 with check. King to e3. Knight comes to f4. And as you can see, this pawn is serving a really, really good purpose for this knight because it's giving the knight a really solid square to outpost on and just really harass that white king. So we got knight down to h2, knight to g2 with check, king to f2, knight back to f4. We got knight to f1. We got knight to d3 with check, king comes to e3. We see knight to f4, knight comes to d2, knight to g2 with check, king to d4, knight comes to h4. We see king to e3. Got knight to g2 with check, king comes to f2, knight comes to f4, knight to c4, knight to d3 with check, king comes to e3. Knight comes to f4. Now you see why I'm doing this, because if I stop like all the different little times and stuff like that, like the video would be like 50 minutes long. So I'm just trying to get through these moves real quick and get to like a specific point. So the knight comes to b2. We got knight to g2 with check again. King comes to e2, g4, pawn takes g4, king to e5, king to f3, knight comes to h4 with check. We see king to g3, knight to g6, king comes to f3. We see knight back down to h4 with check. We see king to g3, knight to g6. We got g5, and g5 can be maybe a possibility coming up. So we got the king having to take because you're going to be having some split pawns going up the board, and you don't want to be in that type of an endgame. King comes to g4. We see knight to e5. King comes to h5. King to f5. King to h6. Knight comes to f7 with check. We see king to h5, and then we have knight coming to g5. Taking the pawn, and we have actually reached another point in the game where white can actually win this position. So if you want to stop the video again and see what white can play to win the game, go ahead and do so. Nah, I'm playing. Man, y'all are sitting there, wait a minute, like, hold on, there's just knights on the board. Yeah, there's no win here. Like, you can't, it's impossible to win this position. So like, hopefully I tricked somebody. Like somebody was like, yeah, man, I'm going to find it. You're not going to find it. It's not going to, no. As you guys should know, there is no possible way to checkmate with a knight and a king by themselves. So yeah, I was thinking about that. I was like, man, let me do that right quick. And like, I'm going to get somebody's going to be like, yeah, man, I'm going to find it. Like, I'm going to get the right answer. Like, no, if you choose a move, there is no right answer. Okay, so forgive me for that, guys. Like, anyway, knight comes to c4. We see king to e4, knight to e3, king takes e3, and then it is in this position that the players do agree to a draw. That's funny. Because as you guys like saw before, you cannot win this position, and white is just going to take here. And then you're going to have the dance of the kings forever. They're going to always be dancing around the board, you know, just like, you know, whatever. Anyway. So that is that game. There was like a couple points that I thought maybe Wesley might could like kind of edge the win out. You know, he definitely had like a couple of chances that, you know, you just never know. I mean, all somebody has to really do is make a mistake, and that's the end of the game. But for all of my people in the Philippines, I'm gonna try the rest of these good mornings. Like I said, it's been kind of a day for me, so I'm gonna see how good I can do this. But I do have every single one of them written down, and I will toss another couple in there. All right, cool. So I got Maayong Buntag. Mayad na agahan, Ninebag na bigat, Masantos ya kabason, Marhe na aga, Buenos dias, Mapia na uma, Maayong aga. I think I did that out of order. Yes. Kapia kapu no dios. This is where it gets tricky. Mapia. I don't want to say that. I'm really spacing on this one. Yeah, Mayap a abak. Mayad na aga. Mapia agay. Mapia kapapita. Then I have I want to say Mukla Abukla. My big Abukla. And then there's Maraja Nabuntag, Maria Mainat, Mape Naaga. And then this one's pretty long. Kasan Yangan Si Elu B. That is Yakan, I believe. But they are also a Muslim type of people. So there's Assalamu Alaikum, and then there's also Salam. So I think with that, I have covered everything. If there's any other ones, let me know. And I will try to look it up and see if it's something I can, go ahead and greet you guys on. But I will switch back over to Tagalog. And I will try to get some more phrases and get more conversational and stuff like that. So I appreciate it very much, guys. And I will see y'all next time.